Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fifth topic of the semester, titled Colonial Society in Transition 1640 to 1763. So this is the third session of this topic, in which we're going to continue discussing the areas of colonial society that were changing and changing very rapidly. And precisely this is going to enable us to understand how the colonies are going to give rise to a unique type of culture, a unique type of society, because this is when we're seeing, of course, the peoples living, for example, in the north, in the northern colonies. We were discussing that in the earlier sessions, dealing with, for example, religion, how the societies are beginning to develop their communities, their religious communities, and how over time those religious communities began to move away from the original vision that the founders of those colonies brought from Europe to create those godly societies, again, the ideal societies, utopias. And we saw that, how over time the descendants of those original settlers began to move away from that vision and become more concerned with material pursuits, with material necessities, and leave religion pretty much on a second plane. So we were looking at that, of course, how the colonies were responding to those changes, how those very conservative societies were responding to those changes. We covered that quite thoroughly. And also, we were looking at how in the 1730s, by the 1730s, of course, religion was in a sharp decline, and it seemed that people were simply going to now move towards a more secular type of social existence, in which religion will become totally secondary and a second plane, or perhaps even less than that. Because they were becoming more and more materialistic in their orientation, in their values, and religion was pretty much being abandoned altogether. Even, again, the beliefs in the supernatural, the belief in the Bible, the belief in God, was being questioned with the rise of the scientific revolution, rational thought. We see that more people were becoming more rational, trying to provide for rational explanations for understanding the world around them and the like. And how by the 1730s there's going to be an intense effort to really bring back religion and spirituality in the colonies, with a phenomenon that became known as the First Great Awakening. Okay, the First Great Awakening. We were looking at that again. This was a 10-year period between 1735 and 1745, in which in the colonies we're going to see the rise of the evangelists. Again, this is a new Protestant Christian group that was trying to transform the way people conducted service, for example, more outdoors, more lively, more charismatic, having no permanent church, but rather traveling from place to place, trying to rekindle people's interest and emotions towards God, towards the Spirit. It was a very intense, again, effort to bring back the idea of salvation as well, and for people to take it seriously, to devote also time to work towards spiritual perfection, if you will, take those religious disciplines more serious, and so on and so forth. And so, again, we're going to see this is a very important period of time that we're going to see the rise of new Protestant denominations like the Methodists, for example, the Baptists, that are going to be very much involved in sending missionaries to the frontier to convert the Native American groups that live in the Western territories, and also sending missionaries to the southern colonies, the plantation colonies, in order to convert the African slaves. So again, there's going to be also that during the First Great Awakening, trying to also expand Christianity and trying to convert peoples that were not already living under Christianity, like the Native Americans and the African slaves that were still practicing their own religious traditions. And we saw again that there's going to be the massive conversion, in this case, of the African slaves to Christianity, giving rise to a unique form of Christianity. It's called African Christianity. So we saw that again quite thoroughly, actually, at the end of session 2. So, of course, there's significant change taking place, particularly in the area of religion, because as time progressed, from the very initial years of those colonies in the early 1600s, what we're going to see is that those religious communities were really experiencing significant change, and they were trying to cope with those changes by employing different strategies, different mechanisms that culminated in the 1730s and 40s with the First Great Awakening. Again, now in this particular session, session 3, we're going to now explore other areas of colonial society. We're going to look at land, for example. Okay, the colonies are going to be growing significantly, and as the colonies are going to be growing territorially, settlers will be moving into the frontier, and there will be increasing interactions with the Native American groups. That is going to produce, of course, more change as a result of natives and European settlers influencing each other, if you will, borrowing ideas from one another, borrowing beliefs and values from one another. And of course, this is going to lead to increasing change. This is exactly what we're going to be doing now in this session. So we can turn to our slide now. Again, let us now look at, in this case, the second area that we're going to be looking at again is immigration, land, and natives in the frontier. Again, this is the second segment, if you will, of this fifth topic, but it's also going to look at change in terms of, again, the population makeup, that is to say, of the colonies are beginning to change as a result of immigration. Of course, those immigrant groups are going to be looking for land, moving west, and there's going to be more and more interaction with the natives. All right, so looking at demographic growth, again, immigration was the primary cause for this population expansion, the growth of the population of the colonies. Okay, because when we look at the colonies, let's say from 1650 to 1750, the population grew from 50,000 in 1650 to 2 million in 1750. At the turn of the century, 1700, there were already a 250,000, actually, again, 247,000 colonists. And this growth, for the most part, was due to immigration. That is to say, there's going to be an increasing number of peoples coming into the British colonies of North America. Most of them are going to be European, the vast majority of them. But what's significant here is that a great many of those immigrant groups coming to North America are not coming from England, okay? As the original settlers, of course, were coming from England to establish the colonies, like New England, Virginia, and the like. They were, for the most part, coming from England. But now, from 1650 to 1750, we're going to see non-British immigrant groups coming at great numbers. I mentioned that, again, the colonies are going to grow from 50,000 to 2 million in only a 100-year period. And again, what I said, the most significant part of this is that a great many of them were non-British. The vast majority of them were coming from Central Europe, from Germany. There were also some Scottish, also immigrants, Irish. They're coming from Ireland. And of course, there will be also increasing numbers of peoples brought from Africa, the African slaves, that is to say, coming to the southern colonies for the most part, although some are taken to the upper colonies as well. Although in the upper colonies, we're not going to see plantations, but there's going to be also the introduction of slavery in the upper colonies for household work and menial jobs, menial occupations. But this is not going to be so significant, again, in the north, understanding the upper colonies. So what this is going to lead to then, this growing non-British immigration taking place, is that this is going to change the social and cultural landscape of the colonies, because this is no longer English culture, okay, per se, in North America. Okay, yes, it's true. The original settlers were from England. There were English peoples coming from England, bringing with them their English culture, their English language, their English traditions, etc. But now we're going to see that the incoming groups, the German, Scottish, Irish, and the like, are going to bring also their unique cultural values, cultural ideas. So we're going to see that the colonies are going to grow more diverse. Okay, this is the rise of ethnic and cultural diversity. This is no longer just English society, but rather, even though, again, those colonies are English, England, of course, is the mother country, and that's true. But the population of the colonies are becoming quite diverse. They're no longer predominantly English. Okay, there's Germans, they bring with them their German language, their German culture. The Scottish and the Irish likewise, although the Irish and the Scottish speak English, by the way, but nonetheless, what's significant is that a great number of Germans, a great number of Irish, just to give you an example, are Catholic. Okay, so we're going to see the rise, the emergence of Catholicism also in the British colonies. And so this is no longer just a strictly Protestant society anymore, but there's also going to be some religious diversity, because there's a growing number of German Catholics, Irish Catholics coming into the colonies, and they bring their unique way of worship. They build their churches, they have their saints, they have their virgins that they pray to, their festivities, and they have different cultural practices and values that contrast very sharply the values of English Protestants. Such as, for example, there's going to be processions, religious fiestas, for example, that might last for several days, devoted to a Catholic saint or a Catholic virgin. And the Germans and the Irish bring with them their beer culture as well. So they're going to craft their own beer, and they're very much fond of celebrating, okay, their birthdays, their marriages, their religious traditions by drinking beer. And again, this is quite just contrasting to the ways that English Protestants conducted their lives. Not that they were totally abstinent and they were not, drinking any alcohol, but again, this is not something that is so characteristic, again, of English settlers during this time. So again, what it's just is indicating is that the colonies are simply becoming far more diverse, okay, far more diverse. And there's more ethnic groups, there's different, religious traditions introduced as well, different ways of celebrating, and so on and so forth. So again, this is the rise of the melting pot, so to speak. This is the beginning stages, the very early baby steps that are going to be moving the 13 colonies that will later become the United States into a kind of multi-ethnic, more multicultural society, a melting pot, if you will. Okay, so this is the transition stage. This is the change again that the colonies are experiencing in terms of changing demographics, increasing immigration, more diversity of cultures and again and religions as well, due to the fact that, as I mentioned in session 2, the African slaves also bring their religious beliefs from Africa, their religious traditions, their ceremonies, their rituals, that even though they convert to Christianity, okay, even though there's going to be a conversion, there's strong elements of African religious beliefs still present in their form of carrying out Christian ceremonies, Christian gatherings, etc., Christian songs and the like. Christian rituals, if you will, are still very much imbued with African traditions. Religious elements are present there. We covered all of that in session 2. So another thing to contemplate regarding immigration is that as new immigrants pour into the colonies, they're finding out that the eastern seaboard, all of that region along the eastern seaboard, is already overpopulated. Okay, and the land has already been distributed among the families that got there first and the like. There's very few economic opportunities for them. So if they are seeking land and economic opportunities for them to prosper, they must move westward. Okay, the expectation is, well, if you move westward, there's going to be some land there. You can actually own your own piece of land, so you can grow your own food. You become a small farmer, an independent farmer, that is to say. And that is the ideal for a lot of those immigrants, to own your own land so you can become an independent farmer, that is to say, because a great many of them came from places in Europe in which the peasants, again, the people that were growing food, that were not, again, in control of the land, that were peasants, that, they were not really farmers. Okay, so the difference between a peasant and a farmer is that the farmer is in control of the land. It owns the land. It's independent, that is to say. And the peasant is not. The peasant, for the most part, works on land that is owned by an entire community in one hand, or is owned by a landlord. So therefore, they must pay tribute, again, to a landlord. Okay. So the peasant is not really in control of the land, so he must work the land, but he must either share the products of the land with the community, or, like in Europe, for the most part, the system was that peasants will simply share part of the harvest with the landlord. So here, we're going to see the opportunity for a lot of those peasants, European peasants that were moving into North America, to actually own the land. That they're going to work and become their own independent, producers. They're going to produce for themselves, for their families. This is going to be their own private, small enterprise, if you will, so they can sustain themselves once again, through the production of crops. So the opportunities are westward. Okay, so most of the immigrants arriving to the colonies will be pushed to the frontier. In many cases, they're going to be moving by themselves to the frontier because this is where the opportunities are presented. Okay, so what that means is that in that 100-year period from 1650 to 1750, the colonies are going to be growing territorially. Okay, because what the colonies are going to do is that they're going to move into the western territories and start clearing the land. They're going to be establishing farms and the like. And with that, the colonies are going to simply be expanding westwards. Very gradual, by the way. Expansion is very, very, very gradual, very slow, but it's also very steady. Okay, and that this expansion is taking place year by year, decade by decade. The colonies are growing territorially. So with that expansion, with more immigrants moving into the frontier, that also implied that the European settlers, whether they were Irish or Scottish, Germans, etc., and even the English settlers that are also going to be moving to the frontier, by the way, is that they're going to interact more constantly with the Native American societies, the Native American groups that lived in those territories. And again, out of those interactions, the Native Americans are going to be far more influenced, if you will, by outside cultural elements, cultural norms, cultural values that slowly but surely the Native Americans are going to absorb partially. We're not talking about a total acculturation of the Native American groups in the frontier, that they're going to become very European, but they're going to adopt a lot of the European ideas that the settlers bring to the frontier. And the Native American cultures, those societies, are also experiencing significant change. Okay, so Native American groups, again in North America, are going to also experience change, just like the colonies were experiencing change. Native Americans are also experiencing cultural change in a very significant way. Okay, for example, just to name 3 areas of change, okay, that Native Americans experience here. Okay, so we understand again how those societies, adapted perhaps to a different way of life because they're going to be influenced by the European way of life. For example, number 1, Native Americans were very well known all throughout the continent. Okay, so not just in North America. When you look at the American continent, period, in all of the Native American groups, from South America all the way to North America, and everything in between. Again, the basic form of social organization of Native American societies, whether they were small tribes or there were large lineages or lineage groups, didn't matter. Again, the complexity, the size of the group is that for the most part, the basic form of social organization is that they were communitarian. So what that means is that they lived in communities, and the community was the most important social organism, okay, that had to be sustained by all members. Not that the individuals were not important, but the survival of the group, the survival of the community was more important than the survival of a single individual. So the idea is that everybody needed to work in groups, okay, working in groups. Everybody had to work in groups, not as individuals, but rather any type of work, okay, that the community needed to do, such as growing food, for example, growing food in the fields, or go out to fish, or, going to the woods for hunting. Food production, that is to say, was a group enterprise. Okay, you had to participate in a group of, commission by the chief. You had to participate in that enterprise in order to actually either till the land or grow the food, corn, etc., or go out to hunt or fish, etc. You go with your peers, you go with your family members, you go with your relatives, etc., in those expeditions, in those endeavors. So those were actually group formations, if you will, that were commissioned precisely to do that kind of work. So building, for example, huts, for a family, individuals did not actually build the hut just by themselves. You invited relatives, family members to help you build the hut. Everybody had a mutual obligation, again, to participate in building the community, whether it is growing the food or building roads or building huts for a new family, somebody just got married, etc. Everybody needed to contribute and participate because everybody was obligated to do so. It's communitarian, that is to say. So all kind of work was group work. Okay, it was a community enterprise, if you will. Okay, so this is the basic form of social organization that Native Americans have lived under for literally for thousands of years. But the Europeans are going to bring different forms of social organization that are more individualistic. In other words, that the Europeans work as individuals. If you need something, you need to do it yourself, that is to say. Okay, so yes, it's true, sometimes you're gonna receive help, of course, from family members, etc., but there's not necessarily an obligation that people felt like I must help my uncle, okay, build his house because he just got married, and I'm obligated to do that. Your uncle in Europe might ask you, to help him, etc. You might agree or might not, etc. Again, it was more of an individual undertaking. Okay, this is something that I have to do by myself. Maybe hire somebody, pay them for that kind of activity. So again, it was more individualistic. European society was far more individualistic than Native American societies. And those values, those forms of social organization are going to be introduced among the Native Americans by the European settlers, and the European settlers are beginning to, the Native American the Native American society are beginning to adopt some of those elements, individualism, for example. In the fur trade, when the Europeans were reaching out to the Native Americans and trying to establish trade relationships with them in the fur trade, meaning that the Europeans wanted the Native Americans to, for example, go out, hunt beavers, for example, bring the furs to them and trade them for European goods. In the early stages of the fur trade, the Native Americans were actually going out to hunt for the beavers in groups. Like I mentioned, they will go in a group formation to go out into the woods, into the hiding grounds of the beavers, to trap them, to hunt them, etc. And they were coming to the European merchants as a group in order to trade the furs for products that all the members of the group obtained. But over time, this particular economic activity became more individualized as Native Americans are beginning to now do the work by themselves. So instead of taking a group with you to go out and hunt a beaver, Native Americans are beginning to simply do that by themselves. Okay, just like the Europeans. The Europeans were individualistic, so Native Americans are also going to engage in individual, personal relations with the Europeans, trying to establish as an agreement with them. For example, a Native American will say, I'll go hunt beavers, I'll bring you 10 pelts or furs, and I'll trade them for whatever product you bring. This is something that you and I agree as two individuals, that is to say. So this is how slowly but surely, okay, Native American societies are becoming more and more European-like, in the sense that Native Americans are beginning to do work more as individuals, not as a community, that is to say. So this is a slow process of change that is changing the traditional ways that Native Americans organize themselves at a social level to do work. Number two is also gender. Relationships are changing as well among the Native Americans, particularly the expectations, the roles that males and females perform among Native Americans are beginning to change, the division of labor, that is to say, because among Native Americans, the expectation was that the female actually was in charge of farming, okay, agriculture, growing crops, that is to say, producing the food from the land, growing corn, growing beans and squash and vegetables. This was the activity that women dominated, okay, in North America, particularly in this particular region that we're talking about. Besides being in charge of the home as well, in terms of bearing children, taking care of them, etc. Okay, males were the ones responsible for fishing and hunting. Okay, those were male activities: going out to fish, going out to hunt. They were the providers of protein intake, if you will, in the family, meat production, by going out to hunt. That was the activity of the male. Again, so this is totally different in Europe, in that agriculture was the responsibility of the male. The male was responsible for farming, again, because that's a hard labor in Europe. That was considered to be a hard labor. And women were simply responsible of the home, staying home, bearing children, taking care of them, etc., taking care of the household, cooking, weaving, etc. Okay, those were the divisions of labor. So this is also going to change among the Native Americans. We're going to see a gradual shift in Native American societies, in that they're beginning to now adopt the European format, okay, the division of labor, in that now farming is going to be done by males, as well as fishing and hunting, by the way, and women are now going to stay home, so they're beginning to adopt the European form of gender roles, the roles of males and females, as well as changing. In another area of Native American cultural change, number 3, is in religion itself. The Europeans, of course, I mentioned that they're sending missionaries. There's Baptist missionaries, there's Methodists, in Puritans as well, by the way, missionaries that are moving to the frontier, with the intent of converting the Native Americans to Christianity. And what we see here is something quite similar to what happened to the African slaves, in that it is true that there's going to be also a gradual conversion of the Native Americans to Christianity. It is true. They're converting. Not all. Okay, so we're not talking about a massive conversion of the Native Americans to Christianity, but a great many are converting. But in this process of conversion, the Native Americans are also going to create their unique form of Christianity that will become known as Indian Christianity. Just like there's African Christianity, the Africanization of Christianity we talked about, there's also going to be the Indianization of Christianity, in that Native Americans are going to convert to Christianity by interpreting the teachings of the Bible, by interpreting the religious symbols of Christianity through their own Indian or Native American religious lens. Okay, so this is not a 100% intact conversion that is taking place, in that all of the elements that the missionaries bring to the frontier, they're going to be absorbed, exactly as the Europeans understood Christianity, but rather they're going to be absorbed. The Native Americans are going to absorb those Christian elements, but they're going to reinterpret them in the process. They're not going to be totally pure in the European form, but rather they're going to be filtered through their own religious lens. So whether we're talking about, for example, the French in Canada, the French are Catholic and they're also converting Native Americans, or we're talking about Protestant groups like the Puritans of New England, or we're talking about Baptists and Methodists that are also moving into the frontier to convert the natives. What is going to happen is that the Native Americans are going to interpret the, for example, the images of Christianity through their own lens. For example, the concept of the Virgin Mary, introduced by the Catholic missionaries to the frontier, will be reinterpreted. It will be reinterpreted by the natives as the Earth Mother. Okay, the Virgin Mary. They said, well, the Virgin Mary was the one that gave birth to the Son of God. So she is the mother of the gods, that is to say. So from their perspective, in their own understanding, that was really the Earth Mother. She is the one that gives birth to everything. She's the mother of all. She is Mother Nature, that is to say. So she's very nourishing. She nurtures all the children because we're all born from the mother. You know, all the animals, the plants, human beings, and even the gods themselves, again, are born from the womb of the mother. And the mother is nourishing constantly the children by producing food, producing rain, producing the elements like oxygen, water, for example, heat, and producing food as well. She's very nourishing. She takes care of all of us, etc. So the Virgin Mary was reinterpreted by the Native Americans in this form of Indian Christianity as simply to be the representation. She is the representation of the Earth Goddess, the Earth Mother, Mother Nature, that is to say, the Virgin Mary. Archangel Michael was reinterpreted as the rain god, because he flies, he's in the sky, he is piercing the clouds with his sword. So instead of being like, the Christian version, the European version of Archangel Michael as one of the archangels that is in heaven protecting the kingdom of God, the Native Americans see Archangel Michael as the rain god. Okay, and likewise the image of Christ. Okay, so Christ himself is going to be seen as the sun god. Because in Native American religious thought, the sun every year dies on December 21st and resurrects on December 25th. Now, of course, the name of the months and the days, etc., they're European. But when you study Native American calendars, just Native American calendars, they have different names, different ways of organizing, of course, time, the Native Americans. But when you study Native American calendars, the day that is interpreted in the European calendars as December 21st, which is really the first day of winter. That's what it is the first day of winter. This is the longest night, the shortest day. So it is interpreted by the Native Americans to be a time when the sun dies, that is to say, because this is going to be the darkest night, the longest night of the year, that is to say, okay? And so for 3 days, this situation proceeds, 3 days, December 21st, all the way to December 24th. In those 3 days, the sun dies, only to be resurrected again on December 24th, 25th. Again, the sun now rises to now be more predominant, more dominant in the day, and the nights, the span of the nights are beginning to shorten after that. It's quite complex. But so when they heard the story of Christ, being crucified, that he died, etc., he was buried, and he resurrected on the third day, they immediately interpret that to be the sun. In other words, just like the sun. The sun is doing this every year, of course. So they said, so this must be the way, again, that we are going to actually worship Christ. We worship Christ because he is the sun god, etc. So again, this is Indian Christianity, okay? This is a unique way of looking again at this religion. Okay, Now, of course, there's also going to be, besides change taking place among the Native Americans, there's also going to be, of course, sources of conflict, because not all the relationships were positive, and some of them are going to be troublesome, of course. And it's also important to understand the sources of conflict between the European settlers and the Native Americans. Okay, so let me just outline the most important sources of conflict, again, between the European settlers and Native American groups. One, of course, is language barriers. The fact is that they don't understand each other. The European settlers bring languages that are totally foreign to the Native Americans. Native Americans also speak of different languages that are totally unknown. Europeans have no idea, again, how to actually interpret the native languages as well. So there's the problem, of course, the language barrier. They don't really understand it. And there's the problem of translation, how to translate words from one language to the other, even though you're learning it. There's going to be a lot of difficulty translating, because every language has words that describe parts of reality that people take as real, okay? But what happens when you encounter other culture in which they have words to describe reality in a way that, from your perspective, those things don't exist? So how do you actually translate that? For example, the guardians of the land, the spirit owners. The Native Americans believe that the land is owned by spirits. They're the guardians. How do you actually translate to Europe in a European language, any European language? Those words, they don't have a direct translation, because from the European perspective, they don't have that concept present in their reality per se. So it was very difficult to translate those words. So in many cases, they were mistranslated, like, oh, well, maybe they're talking about ghosts, or maybe the Native Americans are talking about demons, etc. So, because that's what the Europeans knew. Okay, if you're believing in spirits, well, what kind of spirits are you talking about? Because back in Europe, we believe in spirits, but they're like ghosts, there's demons, there's the devil, etc. So, in many cases, that led to conflict, because Native American religions, in many cases, were interpreted as religions that worship, for example, the dark side, that the Native American priests were sorcerers, invoking, the devil, etc. Because, again, this is a whole different worldview. The European and the Native Americans have different ways of looking at the universe, looking at the world. They describe it very differently. They have different ways of understanding it. And this is going to be, of course, a problem in terms of translating one language to the other, of course. The other one is, of course, territoriality. How the Europeans claim territory is going to clash with the ways that Native Americans claim territory. Okay, it's called territoriality. The Europeans claim territory based on, again, the idea of private property, that individuals, human beings, period, can actually own property. Okay, and in Europe, back during this time, those were, again, actually land grants issued by the monarch, the king. The king was the one that actually awarded a land grant to an individual, again, in order for that individual to oversee the land, to work the land, etc., to protect it, etc. So people use what they call a property title, again, just a land grant, stamped by the king, saying, okay, so this land is mine because the king actually awarded this land to me, and the like. Or people can simply just, purchase it. Okay, by the 16th and 1700s, we're going to see also the idea of, land purchases as well, that individuals can actually purchase the land and have entitlements to the land. And they can pass on those entitlements to their descendants or to another person. Those could be transferable, that is to say. So this is, again, in sharp contrast with what is called Indian territoriality, that is not really based on individual ownership. It is the entitlement of an entire group, an entire community. Okay, the entire tribe has access to a specific territory because this is a territory that was actually occupied by the forerunners, the ancestors of the group. You know, in the distant past, our ancestors, the forerunners of the group, came from a distant land. They were guided by the gods, and the gods actually, you know, placed our ancestors here. And we have occupied this land for many, many, many generations. So our entitlements are based on ancestry, on heritage. That is to say, and the evidence for that is, again, graveyards. The Native Americans protect their graveyards. They bury the dead, particularly in areas that they want to claim, because by doing that, they can always say, look, our ancestors have lived here for many generations, and the proof is we have actually reserved their remains. We have buried them, again, on burial sites or graveyards, etc., that indicate the ancestry. This is the proof that our ancestors have lived here for many generations, and also building shrines. They build shrines in key areas of the territory to worship the spirits, the guardian owners of the land. They build shrines on the banks of rivers, lakes, ponds of water, for example, on top of mountains. And by visiting those shrines constantly, they reassert their entitlements to the territory, because they pray, they sustain the owners of the land, they feed them with prayer. That is to say, so graveyards and shrines are landmarks of a particular group. Whenever you see an Indian, you know, burial site or a shrine that people visit and they conduct ceremonies, it is, again, a way of claiming territory. That's what it is. Again, they're claiming the land. But with population growth, of course, when, again, the immigrants are pouring into the frontier and expanding and creating farms, creating plantations or cattle ranches, etc., you know, there's different forms of enterprise. What we're going to see is that a great many of those graveyards, a great many of those shrines ended up inside of private property, okay, inside of, for example, a plantation. Okay, so a plantation owner happens to have inside of his property shrine that Native Americans are claiming as part of their own, or they have a graveyard there, and in many cases they trespass the property. The Native Americans consider those regions, those sacred, those points as sacred. Those are sacred spots for them, and they're going to be, of course, constantly trespassing property, and this is going to produce conflict, again, because the different ways that they claim the territory. Of course, territories claimed differently. One is private property, the other one is communal, and again, those are concepts that are going to contrast and clash, okay, in a significant way. And the third source of conflict is commercial competition. And the fact is that when the Europeans are arriving to North America, they arrive in order to engage in trade. Remember, trade. We talked about that again in the very start of the semester. They reach out to the Native Americans in order to build trading alliances, commercial partnerships, particularly over the fur trade, and there's going to be a multiplicity of different Indian alliances that will be built by the different European groups that arrive. The French in Canada, the Great Lakes region, again, are building their own networks of alliances. The British, the Dutch, that are also arrived to North America, build their own also alliances, and this is going to produce competition, commercial competition between the European empires that are competing for the fur trade in North America, but also the Native Americans are also going to compete amongst themselves in order to be the preferred, if you will, or exclusive trading partner, you know, of the Europeans. So they're also pretty much trying to monopolize the trade. The Native American chiefs are competing with one another as to who's going to be the main supplier of furs to the Europeans, because that will entail receiving most of the benefits, receiving most of the products that the Europeans are going to bring. So all of those very complex sets of relationships are going to culminate in a larger and larger conflict that spanned for about 7 years, from 1756 to 1763, in a conflict or war that was known in North America as the French and Indian War. Okay, the French and Indian War. This is the perfect case study that illuminates the complexity of relationships that existed between the Europeans that are arriving to North America, particularly the French, the Dutch, and the British, and their relationships with the Native Americans. Again, this is a war that was actually known as the French and Indian War in North America, but in Europe, this same war was known as the 7 Years' War, because it spanned for 7 years, by the way. So let us now look at the French and Indian War as a case study for understanding European Native American relations, in which we're going to see, of course, issues of trade, land, and immigration all coming together to produce this particular conflict. All right, let's go over this case study, the French and Indian War. All right, so as I mentioned, the system of European Native American alliances were established very early on, since the 1500s, including, again, the entire century of the 1600s, moving into the 1700s, particularly because of the fur trade. This is what is going to bring Native Americans and Europeans together commercially. Commercially speaking, they're going to be now creating a system of alliances, because what the Europeans are interested in as they come to North America is the fur trade. So this is what leads European settlers, merchants that arrive to reach out to the Native Americans, because what they want is, again, to establish a trading partnership. The first, that is to say, starting with the French. We talked about that, again, in the second topic of the semester. The French arriving to Canada in the 1500s. They're going to establish the very first French and Indian alliance in Eastern Canada with the Hurons. Again, those are the Native American groups of Eastern Canada that are going to now, become the partners of the French in the fur trade. And as the French expand their commercial operations further into the mainland, again, reaching out to the Great Lake tribes, for example, they're also, again, going to establish their relationships with the Great Lakes. Again, this is the Great Lakes. The French are also building, again, alliances, commercial alliances with the Great Lakes tribes, and also the Cherokees as well. Okay, so there are literally millions, again, of Native American groups that are now partners with the French. They're the ones trading the furs. They're doing all the work for the French and the like. And they're the recipients, if you will, of the benefits, again, that, they receive a lot of merchandise, a lot of goods that the French bring, that they're exchanging for furs, okay, during this time. So this is very important, because the French are going to establish a very, very pervasive, again, system of alliances across all this region, okay, from Eastern Canada, the Great Lakes region, okay, moving all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, present-day Louisiana. Again, all of this region is going to be claimed by France by virtue of the Native American groups that live there, claiming loyalty to France, to the King of France particularly. Not because the French are building in settlements or towns during across this region. Their presence is particularly based in eastern Canada, and is also based in the Gulf of Mexico, and Louisiana is called New Orleans, in the port of New Orleans. But all this region is not really populated by French settlers. There's no French towns, no French settlements, but just simply the exclusive partners of the French, the Native Americans, that claim total loyalty, again, to the French. Of course, the Dutch also built their own Indian alliance with the Iroquois nations that lived in this region, what is called today New York State. That was actually New Netherlands. This is a Dutch colony from 1609 to all the way to 1664. And their trading partners are the Mohawks. The Mohawks are the trading partners of the Dutch during this process. Okay. And the British that come later, after the French and the Dutch, to North America, are also going to build their own system of Indian alliances, also with the Iroquois nations, and also the Cherokees. There's going to be some Cherokee tribes that are going to go and trade with the British. They're commercial partners. What the partnership entails, once again, is particularly is the fur trade. You know, the Native Americans are doing the hunting, the trapping, and all that, and they pretty much trade the furs for European products. Again, so even the British developed their own system of Indian alliances again in the in particularly in what today is called New England, you know, and around that area. Okay, so this is again very simple, just simply commercial exchange taking place, and there's different Native American groups trading with the Europeans. Okay, it's very, very complex, but it's just a system of trade. The difficulty begins to take place when the European empires, the France, England, and Holland, began to compete over the North American trade. Okay, so there's going to be now intense competition. And now this is something that starts in Europe. The French, the Dutch, and the British are beginning to now contest the trade in North America, and they're going to be contesting not only the trade but also the colonial territories, and they want to pretty much displace one another. Okay, so instead of saying, well, there's room for 3 empires here, they're going to now contest, that notion, and they want to displace, and it's pretty much trying to monopolize the entire region, territorially and also commercially as well. And so the first ones to begin this process of contesting, North America were the British and the Dutch. From the 1650s to the 1770s, during those 2 or 3 decades or so, the Dutch and the British are now engaged in a series of conflicts, most of which were fought in Europe. These are called Anglo-Dutch Wars. From the 1650s to the 1670s. So during this time, what was at stake is precisely the fur trade. The Dutch want to dominate that trade and perhaps displace the British, and vice versa. So here, the end result is going to be who is going to stay and who's going to leave North America, pretty much. This is what is at stake in those wars. And again, unfortunately for Holland, Holland ends up, of course, being defeated. Great Britain defeated the Dutch in those what's called the trade wars, they were called. And with that, the Dutch are going to be now moving out of their colonial territory of New Netherlands, and they're going to lose New Netherlands, and in 1664, and actually transfer New Netherlands to Great Britain. we're going to see the transition from New Netherlands to New York. When the British arrive to New Netherlands to now take over the colony, there's a new administration, etc. They're going to rename it. Okay, they're going to actually rename it New York. Okay, and the Mohawks, those are the Indians. This is one of the tribes of the Iroquois nations. They're now the allies of the British in New York. Okay, so the Mohawks remain in the region, and instead of now trading with the Dutch, they're going to trade with the British. Okay, of New York. Okay. All right, so the Dutch are out of the picture. And now we see, of course, Great Britain and France remaining as the only two European powers in North America. And now the British and the French are going to compete, become rivals, trying to decide who is going to be the only European power of North America. Okay? So Britain and France, just like Great Britain and Holland, were battling again for about 20 years or so in the past. Now they're now going to battle again for the control of North America, and they fought about 5 wars from 1688 to 1763. From 1688 to 1763, they're now competing again to decide who is going to be the dominant, who is going to be the only European power of North America. In the last of those 5 conflicts was actually the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War. That was the last and ultimate conflict, the ultimate war over North American trade, as to who's going to be the trading empire that is going to be in North America. It cannot be both France and England. There's only room for one, that is to say. Okay? So, this conflict started out again as, of course, the battle over land. Okay? Because the 13 British colonies, as I mentioned in the beginning of the session, were growing. Territorially, they were moving now west. And now by 1750, again, there's 2 million colonists. There is the sense of overcrowdedness, overpopulation. And the colonists now, the British colonists, want to move west into a region called the Ohio Valley. Okay, the Ohio Valley. The only issue is that the Ohio Valley is actually claimed, okay, this is again the Ohio Valley, is claimed by France. Okay, France claims this land by virtue of simply the native groups that live there being loyal to France. Not that there's any French settlers or anything. So again, we're going to see now the influx of immigrant groups coming from the 13 colonies. There's farmers, traders, and even some planters from Virginia that are beginning to pour into the Ohio Valley very gradually. By the 1750s, it was very, very clear that the colonies wanted to just move into this region claimed by France and the Native American groups that live there. And this is the situation, is that now we see an incursion of people simply moving into this area, which is going to be the area that is going to ignite the French and Indian War. Okay, so the Virginia planters, particularly planters from Virginia, are beginning to move into the Ohio Valley, and the methodology of them claiming this land is by first establishing a real estate company that was called the Ohio Company of Virginia. So to make it legal, in other words, to make it valid, their entitlements, because they want to build, they want to actually build plantations, or they want land for development, and they want to sell land for people that are going to be moving there in the future, etc. It's a real estate company, of course. And so the methodology is that they want to buy the land from the Iroquois. The Iroquois nations that live there, those are Native American, a specific Native American civilization. The Iroquois buy land from them, and once they buy it, and they have, of course, a treaty in which the natives actually, indicate, they state very clearly that they have sold the land. Now they can actually claim it, so they can start developing the land. Of course, breaking it up into plots and selling them, etc., or to develop farms and the like. So they were able to purchase 300,000 acres from the Iroquois during the 1750s, and they are now sending one of the young investors of this company called the Ohio Company of Virginia, George Washington, into this region to start pretty much developing the land. In other words, he's sent as in a reconnaissance mission to survey the land and trying to determine, which lands are going to be claimed and mark them, etc. Okay, but George Washington, of course, as he's arriving there, he notices that France, okay, has already been informed by their Native American trading partners that there are now an influx of British colonies moving there. There's farmers, there are immigrants, traders, etc. in this region, and they're flooding the region, by the way. France is reacting, is right now trying to claim the Ohio Valley. They realize that if France doesn't exert any significant influence in this region, they're simply going to lose all of this territory to the British. So what the French is doing is pretty much recruiting, okay, Indian allies and arming them, giving them horses and, muskets and weaponry, etc. So the Indians are going to be the ones attacking the British colonists, the British settlers, the British traders, again, that want to engage in trade and the fur trade. They're going to be now harassed by Native American groups that are very well armed. And of course, this is something that the French are doing. Where are they getting the muskets? Where are they getting the horses, etc.? Of course, it's France. And also, France is going to be building around this time also a series of garrisons or forts, again, in the Ohio Valley. One of the most famous ones was Fort Duquesne, that later becomes the city of Pittsburgh, much later. So the city of Pittsburgh started out as a fort, Fort Duquesne. In other words, what the French want is to station troops in this region for the purpose of deterring the newcomers, deterring the new groups that are arriving from the British colonies, and at the same time exerting control of this region. In other words, now France has total control of this region because there's now French forces there, of course. So when the Virginians arrive, George Washington arrives to this region, they're going to now face the hostilities of the Native Americans and, of course, the French troops stationed there. And the Virginians, of course, are going to claim that they have bought the land, very legally from the Iroquois, and that they have a legal entitlement, again, to those 300,000 acres of land. But, again, there's going to be conflict because the French are not interested, of course, in those claims. They declare them as illegitimate, and George Washington is going to be, at some point, engaged in a skirmish with the French troops. He's going to be forced to retreat from the Ohio Valley. He's going to go back to Virginia and provide a report that he could not actually take hold of this land that they have purchased because the French and the Indians are there, and they're, totally, again, hostile to the British settlers, like that, for example. Okay, so the decision was that instead of trying to Virginia colony deal with the situation individually by sending a force fighting the French and the Indians by themselves, the Virginians, that is to say, the decision is that maybe what we need is to go to Great Britain and ask the British to assist us in this problem. Okay, it will be better, because what we need is, again, a stronger force. We need Great Britain to defend us, that is to say. So they decided, there was a meeting again of colonial leaders. They sent Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania on this diplomatic mission to England to actually convince members of parliament to send a large army, a large force and supplies to the colonies, because the French and the Indians were now harassing the colonists and, raiding the settlements, raiding plantations and the like, and again, it was a state of hostility. So after a series of negotiations, Franklin was able to convince the members of parliament that this is going to be, necessary to defend not only the colonists, but also because the colonists were going to participate, in helping the British troops fight the French and the Indians in the frontier. And of course, this was very enticing for Great Britain, because, this is going to be, very helpful if we get the help of the colonists to fight the French. Maybe we can get the French out of North America once and for all. Again, so this was a very good negotiation that Benjamin Franklin conducted. It was a mutual benefit type of, agreement. So Britain ends up sending a large army, supplies, to North America. And with that, the French and Indian War begins, the 7 Years' War, the ultimate war over North American colonies, in which the winner of this conflict was going to take all of North America. Okay, is it going to be France, or is it going to be Great Britain? Okay, but the colonists are going to participate again on the side of the British troops to fight the French and the Indians on the frontier. Again, so again, this is the disputed territory, the Ohio Valley. This is where now the Virginians, people from Pennsylvania, virtually from all the colonies, they want to move here. They see this is now the most obvious region that we need to grow into, but the French are there, and they're using the natives to prevent, again, the expansion, the territorial expansion of the colonies. So again, the 7 Years' War, we're not going to cover, again, military campaigns and the like. It's just that this involved, of course, this is a war between France and Great Britain, in which Native American groups, some of them fought on the side of France. We mentioned, for example, the Great Lakes tribes, the Ohio Valley tribes fought on the side of the French. And with Britain, we're going to see the colonists providing assistance to the British troops. Some Cherokee tribes are also going to participate on the side of the British. And the Iroquois, the Mohawks, are also going to participate on the side of Britain. So this was not necessarily, again, a conflict in which all Native American groups come together to fight the Europeans. Native Americans were never really united. They were so very much divided along tribal lines, and they were competing for the fur trade. There were some Indian groups allied with one European party and others with the other European party, and they were pretty much in the in the middle of the crossfire, again, if you will, the Native Americans, because some of them fought for one party and the others for the other, and again, this is a very complex set of relationships. This is not black and white, that is to say, picture. Okay, so in the end, again, we're going to see that the 7 Years' War is going to take a very heavy toll on the French treasury. The French realized that when the war begins, the Indians begin to demand more and more exchange, more gifts from the French. The gift-giving policy, in other words, to sustain an alliance, a partnership. Native American chiefs demanded gifts every month, every year, etc., from their trading partners. So when the war begins, the Native Americans that are doing most of the fighting for the French they demand more payment. They demand more and more products. But on the contrary, what the French are doing is that they're cutting down on those payments. They cannot keep up with so much goods that they actually reduce the number of presents, the number of commercial merchandise that they bring to those chiefs. And with that, of course, the Native Americans are beginning to abandon the alliance with the French. The Native Americans are not really now so enthusiastic to side with the French in this war. And this is going to lead to the defeat of the French. Is again, their treasuries are drained. And most of the people that were supposed to be fighting this war, the Native Americans, are not fighting. So what they're going to do, are they going to send more French troops to North America? This is going to be very costly. Initially, the French were lured into this war with because they thought, well, we got millions of Indian allies that they can fight for us, in North America. We don't have to send so many troops from France. But this ends up, backfiring, of course, in the end. Okay, the Indians abandoned the alliance. So what is the aftermath, the effect of the war, the French and Indian War? Well, again, this is the ultimate war for North America. So the aftermath is that as France surrenders, France is going to lose the empire in North America. They lose Canada, and they're also going to lose the Ohio Valley as well. All of this territory will be transferred to Great Britain, and some portions, again, of the Louisiana territory is going to be transferred to Spain, because Spain assisted Great Britain. So France is out of North America. They're only left with a handful of colonies, the Caribbean colonies of Haiti, Santo Domingo, and Guadalupe. Just tiny colonies. After having built a gigantic empire in the Americas, the Indians are going to be defeated, of course, because they sided with the French. So those that sided with the French were also considered to be defeated after the French and Indian War. So that meant that their lands will become now open for settlement. So the British colonists now think that because the French lost the war, now they're entitled to simply move into those Indian lands because, again, they're, occupied by the defeated alliance. That is to say, the French and the Indians. So now what happens is that as the war comes to an end, Great Britain is going to implement the same policies of France when it comes to the Ohio Valley and trying to protect the Ohio Valley from further settlement and incursions. Okay, why? Well, because there was an open rebellion. Okay, one Native American leader by the name of Pontiac is going to now declare a rebellion against the British because they want the British to protect them. Okay, they want now the British to be the protectors of their lands. And when the British initially refused, there's going to be an Indian uprising. It's called Pontiac Rebellion. So the British realized that they needed the assistance of the Native Americans again. So they said, well, we are going to protect you. We want peace in the region, and we want you to be loyal to us and, be our ally. So they issued the Proclamation Act of 1763, Parliament, declaring all of the Indian territories to be protected by Great Britain, saying no British colonists, the British colonies cannot grow westward anymore because the Indians are protected by Great Britain. Those are Indian lands, that is to say. Okay, so it actually told the colonies that they could not grow territorially anymore because all of the lands west of the colonies were an Indian reserve protected by Great Britain. So again, this exacerbated, of course, the anxieties and the tensions among the colonies that they are not going to be moving any further. They cannot grow territorially, that is to say. The Ohio Valley Company of Virginia was not recognized by Britain. Okay, so even though they have purchased all this land, 300,000 acres of land, is invalid, they said. This is, again, not valid. This is going to create anger among the planter class in Virginia. And we can see, of course, Britain ends up in debt. The 7 Years' War also drained the British treasury, and Great Britain is now trying to impose taxes on the colonies to compensate for the war. Okay, they're going to see the Navigation Act, something we're going to cover, of course, in the American Revolution. So the growing, of course, anxieties because colonies cannot move westward, coupled with new taxes that will be arriving in the colonies through the Navigation Acts is going to lead to growing resentment against Great Britain in the colonies, and the colonies are going to feel that independence was the only way out. Of course, they're going to feel that because they fought on the side of the British, they developed new skills, they grew, they developed, military skills that they're going to actually use in the war for independence, because they were trained by the British to fight the French and the Indians, and this is going to create the conditions for independence. Okay, so this is the end of this topic. There's going to be a series of key terms. They're located at the very end, again, of this session. This is the end of this topic. This is the end of the fifth topic of the semester, and we're going to actually start the new topic in the next session 1, the American Independence Revolution. Thank you.